of Art and Design in Geneva. There is the Department of Interior Architecture. This is where I'm teaching now. And this is a very interesting, I think, program, the ED in Geneva for interior architecture. And in these studies, I'm doing something that most of my course is a design studio called the Anthropocene style. This is the idea of the Anthropocene style is to think that we can redefine, you know, maybe the way of doing interior architecture, no more like during the 20th century in a free style, you know, because maybe if you think why all the tapestry, the carpet, the curtain, the screen become something decorative, it means without really use or function. It was because, you know, the central heating system, the air conditioning, solve all the thermic problem that was made by the decoration before the 20th century. So it means a carpet in reality was a kind of thermal insulation, like a tapestry on the stone wall in the old castle was something to block, you know, the cold radiation coming from the wall. And we have, maybe during the 20th century, we have forget all this function of the decoration, and the decoration between something that was no more really important. It was just decoration with this kind of bad idea of decoration. You know, just it's nothing, you know, it have no use, no function. And today, because we can no more use so much energy, so much, you know, in the interior of the building, so we have to add some thermal insulation. You know, there is some regulation in Europe, in Switzerland. You know, you need to have a minimum of 15 centimeter of rock wool or of what kind of wool you want. And if you think what is this thermal insulation, in reality, it's a kind of new tapestry. It's a new carpet. And we don't think that. We think it's only a problem of a technical problem. It's only, you know, a norm of thermal insulation, but in reality, you can understand that the TVEC, you know, the airproof membrane or the waterproof or the vapor barrier is a kind of new curtain, or and so this is this idea to rethink about the interior in this new regime of the climate change and the energy decrease. And so this is what we are doing the most in the school with Fee. She's with us here. And so we have today we have a group of people. We are doing something more about the materiality of the interior this semester. And so I'm very happy, Daniel, you are with us for this lecture. So I introduce you now. So I will read what I have on my screen. So you are Associate Professor and Chair of the Graduates Group in Architecture at the University of Pennsylvania, Stuart Weitzman School of Design. Your research and teaching is organized two major trajectories. The first involves an archivally-rich revisionist history of architecture modernism, demonstrating the significance of environmental concerns to historical development in the field. The second involves providing a theoretical framework for architects and others to engage the climate crisis. And you have received your PhD in Architecture History and Theory from Columbia University and a Master of Environmental Design from Yale University. And you are involved in a number of interdisciplinary and collaborative projects. And here we can see your book published last year, Modern Architecture and Climate Design Before Air Conditioning. And this is a very important book. I think it's a very good book, and so we are really happy, Daniel, that you can present your work with us today. And please, I stop to share my screen, and please, you can do it.
Yes, fabulous.
Yeah. Okay. Yes.
Okay. Great. Thank you. Thank you so much. And it's great to hear a little bit about the program there at the head school. And I'm very happy to have a chance to play along with your discussions. Certainly this question of sort of rethinking some of the material and mechanical kind of received assumptions about the interior design and our life in interiors is a huge part of what I've been looking at. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Let me see. This little dance here. Give me 1 second. I always have to do a little dance. Oops. Okay.
Yes, it's good. We can see.
Okay, I'm just going to make one little adjustment. Sorry, 1 more second. So, right, as Philippe played out, my research really has sort of 2 components, and I want to try to tease out both of them today in the next kind of half an hour, maybe 40 minutes, and then hopefully have some time for discussion as well. I'm both an architectural historian, working through environmental histories of architecture, thinking about how buildings are situated in their ecological, material, political context on those terms, especially relative to, as we'll be talking about today, questions of mechanical heating and cooling. And part of that idea is just to sort of reveal a rich archive, right? And in the book that was just noted, here's another. Oops. Let me see if I can get the slides to work. Oh. Okay. Here's another image of it. And also in my first book, which called A House in the Sun, which looked at solar heating design strategies and more in the American context. But the idea is, to demonstrate that there's a sort of rich history of these environmental questions in our field, and that they're sort of available as archives for us to go back to and see for inspiration. The second related focus is to convince architects and students such as yourselves, although maybe in this case you're already convinced, but we'll see how this plays out, to focus work on the climate emergency, right? So both as a kind of obvious and also somewhat of a difficult task. I think the challenge that we face in architecture for the past few decades, architecture has sort of reveled in the production of formal virtuosity as the foundation of the field. Despite the fact that buildings and cities are essential kind of aspects of the climate challenge, right? The sort of mainstream of the field, I think, is just kind of opening up towards these questions. Of course, Philippe has been at this for many years, and again, very happy to have the chance to talk this through in this context. So again, I'm going to do a very quick sort of, book summary in a sense. Unfortunately, that's in the end what it is. Just to kind of give us a sense of this broader picture of this history, much too briefly. But then I want to shift gears halfway through and focus in on questions that are essential to the book, but also maybe more broadly to the projects that you're working on in your studio, thinking about questions of comfort. So I want to then start this history just by looking at this building as the sort of foil, if you will, as the sort of inverse of the model that I'm really trying to propose. This is the Equitable insurance building designed by Pietro Bellusci in Portland, Oregon in 1947, often seen as the first fully sealed curtain wall office building, right? So the first, it's not the first actually, one of the early versions where the construction of the project was really just to seal everything in, right, and use a mechanical system to condition the interior. This has been in many ways since around this time, right after World War II, until maybe 10, 15, 20 years ago, the sort of mechanical and climatic foundation of the field, certainly as relates to the experience of the interior, right? So I'm posing this again as sort of what we're not interested in, right? As the kind of normative model, or if you will, kind of mainstream condition that we want to operate in opposition to. What I'm going to proceed with are a number of examples from the book that start to play out those alternatives, right? And start to really see the facade rather as a means to kind of seal the building off from the exterior, right? As a sort of porous engagement with that exterior, organizing architecture as what I like to think of as a device for climatic adaptability, right? So this is one form of climatic adaptability, seal it off and heat and cool it, right? But I'm interested in other kind of versions of that. So we'll go back to the beginning, so to speak, to the sort of heart of the matter for a moment here. Again, doing this all quite quickly, but going back to the beginning in the sense of looking at this project from Le Corbusier, an unbuilt project designed for Barcelona in the early 1930s. A set of small sort of minimum existence dwellings along those lines, quite typical of many of the urban plans of the period, that sought to, in this case, use the facade as a sort of dynamic mechanism, right, to adjust the conditions of the interior. So we can look at a couple of, this is a model actually made much later, but nonetheless helps us to kind of see what's at stake, right? And we can see a couple of issues here. And the main focus that I want to tease out of this just for a moment is not only that this building was essential to sort of reimagine the facade as a climatically adaptive system, but also to do so through visual representation, right? That part of what I'm structuring in the book is a sort of legacy, a sort of history of modern architecture from about 1930 to about 1960 that was focused on producing images around how to adjust our relationship to climate, right? How to kind of reimagine these sort of nature and culture interactions. So in this context, we see, this facade here that obviously has these operable shading louvers that can be adjusted according to daily and seasonal patterns. We see as well in this section, and I'll just sort of be a little obsessive for a moment and zoom in here, right? We see this kind of way of representing that manipulable facade, right? So both the kind of, the diagonal lines and also the horizontal and vertical lines that are attempting to render in graphic form that this facade is dynamic and available for adjustment according to different conditions, right? So I'm trying to sort of map this somewhat tongue-in-cheek, but nonetheless as a sort of originary moment, right, of this interest, not only in a sort of set of climatic adjustments, but also in the ways that those sort of have resonance across a set of graphic communication tools. So I'll reiterate that for a second in the context of Brazil. And oh, sorry, I picked the slide that didn't have the label on it, unfortunately. But this is a building called the Edifício Mamãe, a building built by the firm M.E. Huberto in 1945, an apartment complex in Copacabana in Rio. We're not going to spend too much time on the kind of details of its site, but nonetheless, we see that the kind of dynamism of the facade that's played out, right? So this is another kind of more elaborate version of the media of architecture as a device for climatic adaptability. And we can begin to even imagine, almost kind of choreograph or script those interior conditions as they relate to this facade, right? So we imagine you might want to wake up in the morning and open the sash, right? And then around noontime, you'll maybe make sure the vanes are correctly tilted so as to block the sun out, right? And maybe adjust the blind in the evening while you're sitting in your sort of planted space here, allowing the sun to come in or not, depending on variations of climate, et cetera. So in part, and already suggesting a sort of broader aspect that I want to play out quite a bit, the notion that the sort of practice of climate adjustment is on the one hand kind of structured by the architectural design, but then is sort of enacted by the occupant, right? So that we have both the design aspect and the kind of experience of that aspect in the interior. So two sort of points already, I think, on the table, I hope, maybe three actually. The first having to do with the graphic elements, right? The kind of media of representation as a means to understand this climate relationship between the conditioned interior, here not conditioned mechanically, right? And the sort of changing climate outside. The second one being kind of figuring architecture as a device for climatic adaptability, right? Kind of understanding that as one of the engines of the modern period, of the kind of early developments of architectural modernism. And then the third being this question of thermal practices, right? Of different ways in which the design and the forms of inhabitation work together to sort of articulate those specific climatic relationships. I'm just going to run through a few images to help sort of play this out for a second. Again, much too provisionally, just to show in part that, in the broader kind of version of this, I try to make this elaborate argument that in fact, by virtue of this climatic adaptability, we could argue that modern architecture emerges from this Brazilian context, right? That it's really in Brazil, in the global South, in the context of finding ways to use shading mechanisms to sort of accommodate different types of interiors. It's in that context that a certain flowering of modernism begins and then spreads around the world, right? So it's kind of a counter narrative. I'm actually following here Barry Bergdahl, the eminent historian and curator who writes in a catalog in 2015 that these images, these buildings in Brazil are sort of previsions of a modernization to come, right? Rather than receiving knowledge from Europe and the US, they're sort of cycling it back, right? So trying to disrupt some of those patterns of influence, but also just to sort of celebrate the diversity and the variability of these mechanisms. This is maybe a building that many of you know, the Ministry of Education and Health by Costa Niemeyer and their colleagues, often regarded as one of the largest kind of first kind of large-scale administrative structures of concrete modernism. Also one of the more prominent modern buildings in Brazil. And, again, the book I trace a bit more, some of the legacies that this is building on. One of them indicated here. So, just trying to sort of map and fill out some of this picture of sort of thinking about Brazil as the emergence of a certain relationship of, in fact, the built interior, the design of that interior as a sort of climatic object or climatic space, how it relates to the exterior. What I'm skipping over here today, unfortunately, is the kind of interventions of scientists, of building scientists, right, of other sorts of specialists that helped to clarify the precise details of where the louvers should go and how they should be hung and what direction, et cetera, according to emerging knowledge around meteorology. But in the spirit of this sort of quick run through, I want to jump to some other projects to expand this picture, right? And if we're sort of beginning in Brazil in a way, or sort of trying to claim Brazil as one of the originary sites, part of what's at stake there, given the political complications of Brazil in the 1930s, in the midst of what's referred to as the authoritarian democracy of Getúlio Vargas, of the so-called Estado Novo in that period of time, we begin to see, and this building also helps us to clarify this, that this kind of legacy of the shaded facade is not simply a means to sort of open up a certain type of building practice in areas that might not have as much access to infrastructural energy sources. But we also begin to recognize that these are, in effect, tools for certain types of interventions, right? And in this case, it becomes quite explicit. This building by Fry, Drew, Drake, and Lasden, designed, in fact, primarily by Jane Drew, again, with this different banks of operable vertical louvers in this context to shade the interior from seasonal conditions of the climate. This building actually opened, so this is the headquarters for British Petroleum, right? A corporation that extracted and in fact kind of decimated the Niger Delta, incredibly negative impacts on both the ecosystems and the social conditions of Nigeria. This building actually opened at the moment, really the same day, quite literally the same day that Nigeria declared independence from the UK, right? So we see this sort of shift, right? This sort of, again, another kind of cycle, right? That's maybe less of an arrow pointing one direction, a shift that an arc perhaps that indicates that the kind of transformations of the post-colonial period were soon filled in by these corporate agents in order to maintain a quite familiar set of exploitative social and resource conditions. And one of the mechanisms of that exploitation, right, of that intervention, was the ability to insert a building that was sort of climatically adjusted by virtue of this shaded facade. So that I'm encapsulating far too many things in just a few sentences here, and I'd be happy to elaborate in discussion, but I don't want to get too caught up, so I can cover some more material. But other aspects of that persist. Here we have Sert's part of his US Embassy complex, in Baghdad, in Iraq. And again, just a sort of indication that the sort of use of these shading mechanisms was in part in order to bring a certain type of political or corporate or economic agent into a region that was seen as sort of climatically hostile, right, as sort of less habitable to these northern Western agents, individuals. And so these architectural adjustments were a sort of mechanism to bring them in. So complicating these stories of modernity, right? I mean, complicating, or at least inserting, when we insert climate into the picture, part of what I'm trying to play out, we recognize that modern architecture was deeply enmeshed in questions of coloniality, of corporate excess, of extractive resource politics, et cetera. We kind of see these design tools as means to up and up, right, different regions to a certain type of exploitation. But if I'm encapsulating modernity in that way, and going back to Bergdahl's notion that these buildings in Brazil were a prevision of a certain type of modernization to come, what we see here, and these are versions of some of the buildings that we've already seen and some that we'll see later. This one on top is that dynamic facade that I showed you the sort of choreography to a few moments ago. All of them now with air conditioners inserted, right? So in some sense, this kind of modernization that came was that of the mechanical air conditioning system, the fossil fuel derived cooling capacity that dramatically transformed the conditions of the interior in ways that those shading mechanisms could not have, and in ways ultimately that were, as we're still coming to terms with, right, quite detrimental to the global climate. So one more quick kind of narrative here, story here, before I jump to a second part. So in that first arc, right, in that first kind of discussion that says that modern architecture kind of emerged in some sense, or a certain type of it emerged out of Brazil and performed this climatic adaptability, but did so in many ways that are in ways that are quite discomforting, and then kind of cycle back, right, to those air conditioned systems. That's kind of one narrative. That's the narrative of the sort of passive cooling techniques, or at least the shading techniques that allowed for a certain type of life to persist. What we see after World War II, and a bit more aggressively in the American context, is the kind of technologization, right, or scientification, if you will, of these different design strategies and practices, largely through the Olgai brothers, whose book Design with Climate is still an important text in this field, largely through their experiments out on the lawn here at Princeton University in the 1950s. And again, the kind of important aspect here is the emergence of a certain type of analytic project, right? I mean, this is what we see on the left was the Olgai's thermoheliodon, an attempt to model and kind of regulate the conditions of a building environment. In fact, a kind of just pre-digital climate modeling technique, right? I mean, just before the computer took over, quite literally, historically, an attempt to perform this analysis that says one of the kind of essential aspects of understanding a building project is understanding its site for its very precise climatic conditions. And they produced this very opaque methodological system, right, that's quite hard to follow in any short form, and certainly even if you dig into it, it's pretty complex. However, again, it's since been computationalized, right? I mean, if anyone is familiar with the Ecotect performance software, it's now sort of embedded into Revit, into other AutoCAD products. But Ecotect was initially programmed by a Western Australian architect directly out of the Olgai's diagrams such as this, right? So what we're seeing again is a sort of pre-computational set of systems and parameters and structures and processes that encourage the designer to attend to the details of the site in producing the architectural object. So just to close this loop far too quickly, but nonetheless, to suggest that part of what's at stake as these climate systems became technologized, if you will, became industrialized, entered into a broader set of architectural research strategies by virtue of providing certain technical systems and their parameters, is we see the emergence of this concept of comfort, right? And that's what I'm going to switch to in a moment. Here we have in the Olgai's drawing, though, a really clear indication, right, of what that comfort is to indicate, right? I mean, this is one of the Olgiai brothers, Aladar, you can tell because they were twins, and Aladar always had a pipe, right, to distinguish him. But you see this sort of notion of comfort, of relaxing in the chaise, of reading the paper, of smoking the pipe, right, sort of being protected from all of these other possible conditions that surround you. So this notion that part of the project, again, of the design process is to articulate a condition of comfort that will allow the building to mitigate and modulate the various climatic conditions in which it finds itself, so as to produce the optimal conditions on the interior. Now, the kind of coda to this story, the kind of epilogue to this story, is that while these comfort conditions were theorized, were experimented with by the Olgiais and their colleagues without mechanical conditioning, right, without air conditioning systems fed by fossil fuels, the basic parameters that they articulated were soon sort of captured by ASHRAE, by other sorts of regulatory systems that sought to optimize in various ways those thermal conditions of the built interior. So in effect, these non-mechanical mechanisms and design systems that allowed for the production of a certain type of comfort were quickly translated and sort of co-opted into a set of mechanical systems, fossil fueled, of course, that again have led to quite detrimental disruptions to climate patterns that we're now really trying to struggle with today. Okay, so that's kind of the first part. It's always far too quick, right? Even a little quicker today because I wanted to get to some details about this sort of question around comfort, but I hope it gives you some sense of the broad archive, right, that can be harnessed to reimagine some of these histories of architecture that we're familiar with in order to insert these questions of climate, to some extent, questions of energy and fuel use as well into these equations. What I want to do now is I'm actually going to read a text that emerges from an essay I published that I circulated to you as well, to give us a sense of some of these issues that emerge from talking about comfort more directly. And I'm going to do so while sort of clicking through, right, some relevant images that are not directly tied, right, to any given sort of notion in the text, but just to help us to kind of get a sense of you know, what's on the table. Okay, so here I go. I'll read for about 10 minutes and then we'll open up to discussion. So the opposite of comfort is obviously discomfort. The first we seek, the second we try to avoid. Comfort is valued because it promises consistency, normalcy, and predictability, which allow for increased productivity or a good night's sleep. Our collective allegiance to comfort is a form of self-assurance that we are not threatened and that tomorrow will be like today. Comfort indicates that one has risen above the inconsistencies of the natural world and triumphed, not only over nature and the weather, but over chance itself. We can rely on comfort. It will be there when we get back. Comfort is integral to our designed interiors and to the causal chain that ties heating, ventilating, and air conditioning HVAC systems to the fuels that feed them and to the carbon emissions that result. Comfort applies to many aspects of contemporary life, from the mega mansions of the suburbs to luxury upholstery and cars. In this general sense, it is tightly bound with consumption. The thermal conditioning of interiors is of specific interest because it relates to the purview of architects, and certainly interior architects, and because it is invisible and difficult to disrupt. Design is part of this causal chain, in other words, organizing and aestheticizing the connection between comfort and carbon. Class distinctions are distinctions of comfort, both broad and fine-grained. These are also economic and geopolitical distinctions. The West, the global North, the geography of industrialized capital, the global territory of air conditioning, politics in the 20th century revolve around access to comfort. The rungs of the ladder to luxury are physical, spatial, architectural, and thermal. First comes sustenance, then shelter and protection from the elements, then heat, and last cooling, so as to remain active, healthy, and productive year-round. After these come layers of precision, filtered air, sealed membranes, sensors everywhere, all the elements of the comfort industrial complex that aims to wrap itself around the body like a favorite shirt. Yet comfort, like capital, is unevenly distributed. Not everyone gets to have the same amount. When you have it, it is hard to let go. It's even harder to convince someone to give it up. Comfort feels normal, expected, obvious, deserved. To be well off means to never be uncomfortable. The life of the poor is awash in discomfort, striving for relief. This struggle for comfort is a struggle for equity, justice, and conditions amenable to growth and self-actualization. Comfort, however, is in short supply, not because we are running out, but because we have to collectively adjust to its going away. Or rather, architects have to help make it go away. The scarcity of comfort is something architects have to produce through a conscious redesign of the built environment. Since we can no longer emit carbon, we cannot be air conditioned in the same way. Buildings must be conceptualized, designed, and built differently. We have to reconsider and renegotiate the terms of comfort, as well as those of productivity, equity, and equality. It is nearly impossible, at least in the US, to design for discomfort. The cultural industrial apparatus we frame as architecture does not generally interrogate comfort, of course, present company excluded. The presence of HVAC is presumed with a few exceptions. It is invisible, hidden in drop ceilings, shafted behind walls and under floors. This epical aspect of building culture, that is HVAC, essential to our near and long-term future, is not readily available as an element of design or an object of discourse. Comfort is considered to be outside of architecture in this context, the realm of consultants, despite the deep interiority of mechanical systems and the reliance in so many buildings on an impenetrable membrane. And yet, the computational production of novel form relies ineluctably on mechanical conditioning. All of the architectural debates of the last 5 or 6 decades, the neo-modernisms and postmodernisms, the parametricisms and object-oriented ontologies, all have relied inexorably on fossil fuels. Comfort has not recently been a subject for invention, imagination, or experimentation. Every little click and hum of the air conditioner kicking in and every creak of a radiator is a slow, extended, symphonic lament accompanying the decline of civilization. Comfort is destroying the future, in fact, one click and hum at a time. Comfort relies on invisibility. You don't see it, you pretend not to hear it. It's just there, expected. Not only is the HVAC system hidden, so is the boiler, the fuel, the network of extraction, the labor exploitation, the carbon cost of distribution, the emissions into the air. Comfort is normal, the epitome of the normative, regulated and rationalized, embedded in constructed systems and industrial supply chains. How can we design for discomfort and reveal these implicit structures of ventilation, of decarbonization? How can we frame livability, lifestyle, and life itself in the context of the geophysical and geopolitical implications of comfort? Could it feel good to be uncomfortable? Perhaps there would be a pleasant sense of participation in a changed global thermal regime. We are no longer protected from the elements. The elements are assailing us, determining our collective future. The experience of comfort inside is predicated on the global acceleration of climate instability outside. We are exposing ourselves to the elements through sealed, conditioned spaces. The challenges of climate change are both political and physiological. How many will be discomforted, and to what extent? Transforming personal and social expectations is one important element of this challenge. Not the personal virtues of reduced carbon living, but the collective reframing of cultural values. Can we imagine, articulate, and proliferate a culture of discomfort? What does it look like, and how does it feel? And how do we get there? It's a magnificent challenge for architects who, as a profession, are so inextricably entangled in capital, yet licensed to imagine. Design for discomfort is a new opportunity, a degrowth industry. The built environment is contingent. It was constructed according to specific socioeconomic conditions, collective desires, and cultural interests. It can be rebuilt according to new conditions, new desires, and new frameworks for cultural elaboration. Such reconstructions also reimagine relationships to resources, economy, exchange, and equity. Architecture's new ambition is to condition humans to be less comfortable. A first step, retrofit. House Resolution 109, which was the kind of proposed legislation of the Green New Deal in the United States context, and relates, in fact, quite directly to the new European Bauhaus discussions in the EU. House Resolution 109 calls for, quote, upgrading all existing buildings in the United States to achieve maximum energy efficiency. The Green New Deal reaches out towards disciplinary transformation. It hurts, though, perhaps, to think of architecture's role as simply upgrading. It reveals burning questions. What new construction can be justified? If it is really all about carbon, what is left for architects to do? Where can we focus our carbon budget? On hospitals, archives, spaces for healing? What other spaces, residential, commercial, for work and play, can be left open to the elements, at least figuratively, if not practically? The savvy design collective of the near future sees opportunity in designing for discomfort, in careful retrofits that reduce comfort, reduce carbon, offer new ways of living. Through collaborations with physiologists, engineers, artists, and others, design methods can not only reduce reliance on mechanical conditioning, they can also be compensatory, creative, and instructive. The experience of a room or a city can encourage and reward the lifestyle, habits, clothing, and activities that reduce comfort. This transformation is profoundly cultural. It resists sustainability metrics and exceeds performance softwares. It focuses instead on the contours of our desires and our values. This is the role for architecture, even in the context of retrofits. Make discomfort desirable. Help us all find pleasure in a new causal chain, one that starts with the less conditioned interior, extends to the less carbon-filled atmosphere, and revolves itself by tempering the inequity, exploitation, and destruction that increase with climate instability. Discomfort does not have to be a bad thing. We will be discomforted either by design or by default, which is to say, if we don't do something about it now in quite dramatic ways, the conditions of the near and long-term future will introduce discomfort into our lives without our direct intentions. This architecture of discomfort will be multifaceted. The glory of architecture is that it revels and relies on its own creativity, in the pleasant unfamiliarity of effective space. It provides something new, yet the terms of this novelty have been too tightly prescribed. Unleashing architects to design for discomfort can produce spaces, materials, and systems wholly unimaginable in the present. We anxiously await this explosion of post-carbon creativity. Okay. So I'm happy to stop there and open up for questions. I did that first part a little quicker than anticipated, so we've got some extra time. I'm happy to return to any details and clarify anything that might have been run through too quickly, or certainly address questions around this issue of comfort and discomfort, or whatever is most effective for your studio.
Thank you, Daniel. Yeah, I was wondering, maybe I have a first question, and then, the discussion about climate when I was student or before, it was, we saw a lot of image like the one you have show. It was more for the South country, for more hot country. So it's we learn about climate link. We learned that we have to think about climatic issue when we are doing something for the equatorial latitude. Yeah. And there is a lack of thinking about the Nordic latitude. When I was, it was not really, it was like, it is normal to use central heating system, radiator, but it was not normal to use air conditioning. So there is a kind of unbalanced discussion between, okay, in Europe, in Switzerland, we can use radiator, but if we are doing a project for South latitude, we need not to use air conditioning.
Right.
And I was sometime in some panels, some discussion about that. And I was little stuck about that, because it was a discussion. I remember it was a discussion about the air conditioning in, I don't remember which country it was, maybe Vietnam, something like that. And the people, they were talking about this kind of Americanization of the Vietnam through air conditioning, you know, like it was like a cultural point of view to bring air conditioning into Vietnam, because in Vietnam there is some solution for not using air conditioning in the history, and
Sure.
The introduction of air conditioning was more a cultural decision than or maybe an imperialist decision more than a physiological decision. And this type of discussion was, I think it was not fair in a certain way, because it's like, okay, in Vietnam, you have to use natural wind and natural solution, but in Switzerland, you don't have to use natural earth warming,
Sure.
or I don't know,
Sure.
like
Sure.
cold, you know, like the animals in Europe was part of the heating system, you know, there were lots of animals inside the house to heat the house. So, you know, the people, they live with animals to have a benefit of. So why we don't have to use animals to live with a cow inside the house in Switzerland, and but we can use radiator, but in Vietnam they have to use natural wind. So I think it was not very fair. And when we made a project in Taiwan, it was the same, you know. In Taiwan, in reality, the people, they complain about heat. You know, if you are a Taiwanese people, you know, you complain about heat in the same way that if you are Swiss, you know, there is no distinction. The relation to the heat or the cold, you know, we are all human, we are all 30 degrees Celsius. We are so. If you are
no, I think you bring up a number of really interesting points. I mean, on the one hand, and you know, this is a different sort of pile of slides and you know, different lecture, but the first book that I wrote really looks at strategies for solar heating, right? Which of course are related. I mean, there's, you know, and we know today when we're taking on these different sort of bioclimatic approaches that understanding how to passively heat and passively cool a building are, you know, intimately related in terms of material systems, in terms of shading devices, in terms of orientation, all sorts of aspects. But I think, you know, that it's, you know, so on the one hand, the sort of techniques and technologies exist, and in fact, you know, much of the work, I mean, much of it is generated out of the early experiments. Well, some aspect of it is generated out of the early experiments of Felix Trombe in the Pyrenees and elsewhere. Other, you know, cooling systems that are both passive and also sort of pre-photovoltaics, using different materials and different chemical solutions for heat storage, right, and other sorts of systems. So on the one hand, I'm completely agreeing with you that there's just sort of a bias or a sort of cultural bias in the kind of excitement about exploring cooling techniques that are perhaps most applicable to, let's just say, the global South, while continuing to rely on carbon-hungry boilers and radiators and, you know, heating systems across Europe and North America. One of the things I discovered in that research was that part of the difficulty was, again, relative to questions of comfort, right? That in order to rely on solar heating for a house, well, what most solar houses did, and this was in the 1940s and 50s, at a moment when it wasn't quite clear, you know, sort of how much oil there was going to be, right? I mean, this kind of massive amount of reserves in the Middle East and Venezuela was not completely evident at the time. But what became clear was that you build your house for passive solar heating, but you also need to sort of have a boiler or some sort of heating system, you know, for when it gets too cold. And often the expense of doing both of those things, right, of both having a lot of glass and other aspects, insulated glass even by the late 40s, that allowed for a certain amount of passive heating, combined with the kind of backup mechanical system, made the whole prospect too costly, right? So because there was no discourse that suggested that one should, just put on a coat or wear your long underwear if it's cold outside, or, other sorts of, let's call them, individual or physiological adaptations that are less kind of structurally embedded, it became difficult to sort of play out some of those arguments in that period. But I think you bring up an even more important issue. I mean, in the sense that, that's a kind of technical challenge that is perhaps quite readily, in some ways, quite readily resolved by, as it has been, by more installative glass membranes, by other sorts of material innovations. But the other issue you bring up is that also plays out relative to, let's just say, the kind of Switzerland-Vietnam contrast, right, that you posed, is that part of the project of modernity, generally speaking, as a cultural phenomenon, right, and certainly of modern architecture, part of its ambition was to appear to, and to some extent to actually delegitimate pre-modern practices, right? So to say that, this concrete, steel, and glass object, passively cooled and kind of carefully designed, let's go back to Brazil, right? I'm more familiar than the cases in Vietnam. The shading strategies that were played out in Brazil, in fact, drew on customary practices, right? Practices that were quite evident from the sort of pre-encounter period. I mean, based on the indigenous populations, but also in many different forms of colonial, neo-colonial interventions as well, and the kind of casual practices around the country. But rather than kind of celebrate those customary practices and integrate them into the modern idiom, right, they were sort of held at bay and reconfigured and rendered into concrete and sort of played out on different terms, right? So we see that in many different contexts, one way to look at those buildings in Brazil, for example, is to recognize that the amount of sort of cooling and daylight management that those shading systems provided didn't quite justify, frankly, the expense of the facade, right? There was a political aspect that was also going on. There was a sort of claim to modernity, right, that this type of building suggested that was important for the political and economic sort of industrialization process that Brazil was involved in, right? So there were other issues, other ambitions, other things at stake relative to sort of using these devices, using these modern techniques, again, as a means to delegitimate some of these pre-modern practices and sort of enter the culture into a certain type of global modernity, right? So I think that plays out still, this kind of sense of progress, of modernity, of technology, that it can be quite, and I know that your own work has complicated this quite dramatically in terms of the thermal experience of interiors, but that it can be quite difficult to argue for, in the context of innovation and disruption and speculation that our field is consumed by, quite difficult to rely on familiar, customary, we could call them indigenous, traditional, vernacular sorts of strategies, right, to often attain the same goals without, while using far less hydrocarbon fuels. So that aspect of, let's say, the kind of embedded bias that's involved in these questions of technological progress, I think is not one to be overlooked. And I think the last point that you make, and that's also a hugely important point, is that, that's often referred to under the context of adaptive comfort, right? Which I think is a bit of a too loose of a term. But it's to say that in the process of, seemingly conditioning spaces, we have in effect kind of conditioned ourselves, right? Again, the situation is more extreme in parts of the United States than it is in most of Europe. But given or one could look at Singapore, for example, which with the sort of ubiquity of air conditioning in that city, that we have ourselves adapted to anticipate a certain type of thermal interior that is quite carbon intensive, right? And to, whereas we are, as humans, as a species, as distinct cultures across the planet, quite adaptive, quite amenable to other sorts of thermal conditions, right? Whether that, and I'm not trying to say that there's something essential to the Vietnamese, that they want a certain type of thermal comfort, and there's something essential to people living in Florida that they require a certain amount of air conditioning or something, but rather that all humans, all societies are quite flexible and adaptive according to different needs and different demands. And that once we start to experiment, either by desire or, or again by default, once we have to, I think we'll find that indeed these non-mechanical systems can often provide quite adequate heating and cooling, right? Once we allow ourselves to adjust our expectations, right? So there's some aspect of this comfort question that really is a lot about aspiration, right? What do we desire? What do we aspire to? What do we kind of think we deserve, in a sense? And how can we adapt those aspirations? This played out. I had a sort of on running joke with a colleague on Twitter a few summers ago. Philadelphia is brutally hot and humid in August, right? I mean, it's really just unbearable. And I was trying really hard to not use any air conditioning. We had our house didn't have a house-wide system. We had one room that we could put that we slept in, that we could have the conditioner in, but I was trying really hard not to use it. And a colleague of mine in Baltimore, we sort of had this contest to see who could go the longest without turning it on. And it sort of came down to, well, is it okay if I don't write another article, right? If I'm too hot to work, if it's too sweaty to get anything done, right? How do we sort of assess the relative cost of these carbon conditions, right? Can I give that carbon to somebody else who needs it and, sweat during August, right? I mean, how do we begin to really reimagine this kind of economy that we're involved in of using and abusing our carbon privilege, right? Relative to questions of health, questions of air quality, where areas where air conditioning is really quite vital for survival, right? Anyway, a long answer to a really interesting set of complex questions. Happy to entertain some others if there are any.
Thank you. Is there some other question?
Yeah, I think I will ask something, I guess, in the line of Philip. And thank you so much for the presentation. And I'm super intrigued by your idea of like design for discomfort, because normally, when we design, we think about how to optimize the interior space, how to make our clients most comfortable. But then I think there is also, I think I have two things. Firstly, I think you mentioned in the paper that you circulate for us, about historical lessons, like what we can learn from the past. Because what I've noticed that normally vernacular architecture, we don't have the technology, we don't have all the energy. So people in the past had found very different ways to, like create natural lighting, natural ventilation. And on the other hand, that of course wouldn't make us like totally comfortable to the point that we can wear a t-shirt during the winter. So what do you think, like how, I guess I'm asking, how do we as architects, more for the students as well, can it's more practical, like how can we persuade our clients that they should also be comfortable with being discomforted for the sake of the future? And from the point of view of students, what can they do, as designer being trained, how can they prepare themselves for that kind of work, even when they start working? And of course, their boss wouldn't let them just design for the discomfort, because definitely not.
No, it's, I mean, this is in a way this is the question, right? I mean, how to few clients will come to you and say, I'd like a house that makes me uncomfortable, right? Because I care about the future, or, whatever the way they might frame it. I mean, this is not to be anticipated. At the same time, and, in my own experience in different schools around the world, and, teaching and visiting and these sorts of discussions, et cetera, part of what we do as architects is we kind of imagine, we speculate on the near-term future. We kind of imagine what might seem to be impossible. We produce spatial experiences that are often a bit unfamiliar, right? And sort of revel in that pleasure, in that kind of excitement that comes from that novelty and that affect, that affective condition. So I'm, part of what I'm trying to suggest is that if we take that sort of drive and say that part of what architects do is creatively imagine the spatial conditions of the near future, what if we insert, carbon emissions and comfort standards into those equations, right? What if we say that, and again, this is, I'm in good company here with Philippe's experiments and explorations over the past couple of decades, right? I mean, really focused on this versions of this same sort of debate. Which is in part to say, I think that what students can do is experiment, right? And is, see this as a space for creativity. And, for example, I was talking to one office based in Boston that was not, using their office much during the pandemic, of course, and didn't want to keep it kind of heated to only wanted to keep it kind of minimally heated during that period. But then when they had a client meeting, it took so long to heat the space back up, a kind of lofty space, right? That was impractical, right? They had to keep it at a kind of, so what, we just, I don't know if they actually did this, but what we decided in our kind of discussion was that they should just have a kind of rack of down coats, right, at the entrance, right? And so you walk into the space and you warm yourself up, or maybe you put, have some sort of space heater or fire pit in the middle, whatever the conditions might allow. How can we begin to, really experiment with non-normative models of providing relative comfort and see that as a space of cultural elaboration, right? And see that as something to write about and to produce exhibitions about and to, put into the journals and to really start to kind of play around with on those terms to cultivate this broader discourse, right? And simultaneously, I think, one can also, I think, stay really attentive to collaborations with building scientists, with physiologists, with anthropologists, ethnographers, others that are quite deeply engaged in this discourse about a sort of life after carbon dioxide emissions are able to be so plentiful. What are they thinking about? What are the technologies that are coming out, that can inspire some of those creative elaborations, right? What are some of the ethnographic or anthropological sites of knowledge, right, that can really play out some of those conditions in new ways? And I think also, as you suggested, and we just sort of touched on relative to the first question as well, how we, the extent to which we have so much of this knowledge, right, embedded, whether it's tacit or technological or, written down, as a broad sort of planetary culture, we have so much knowledge about how to live in many different types in many different climates, in many different buildings within those climates, according to different kind of facade systems, et cetera. So to explore some of those, right, to see the project of exploring history was only about, the kind of modern narratives that I've myself quite exclusively focused on, but also on those other narratives, those other stories, those other practices, right? And how can they be sort of brought into this modernity in a different way?
Yeah, I really appreciate what you've been talking about, because actually I remember when I was a student, architecture student, and I read my teacher's essay, Florian of Soil. And I still remember he said, like, let me be an architect and don't ask me to think so much about the environment, because he doesn't believe that we can really produce something like beautiful or like whatever architecturally aesthetic without, with all the burden of being responsible.
Right. Well, no, and yeah, and this has been the ongoing challenge, since the 70s or maybe the 50s, right? How do we, and this gets a little too big picture for, the next couple of minutes, but how do we begin to imagine a sort of aesthetic formation that takes future humans into account, right? So, which is to say, beyond not only just a kind of non-formal or an aformal approach to a kind of culture of architecture, but really more, one that's more aggressively willing to say that, part of aesthetic pleasure involves species continuation, right? How does that, I don't know the answer, but kind of what are the mechanisms, conceptual, technological, architectural, to help to kind of reframe, right, some of those ideals and values, right? And I think one of the places we see it in our field is through retrofit, right? I think the Lacaton and Vassal awarding of the Pritzker Prize is huge, right? In terms of in terms of recognizing the creative potential of reuse, right? And again, which many of us have seen for decades. And I mean, this is not news exactly, but having it sort of play out in that prominent venue, I think is quite useful, quite a good step, right? Yeah, to really recognize that one of the easiest ways to save carbon, and it gets into a set of embodied energy discussions, of course, right, is to use existing building stock, but also to see that as a space for creativity, right? And to kind of embrace that as a space of aesthetic collaboration, yeah, in ways which are disruptive, which are uncomfortable, you know, in a different sense to, you know, some generations, some practitioners, right? The kind of tools that we've come to, the ways in which we've come to see architects having agency and kind of cultural validity are challenged by some of those assumptions, right? So how to rise to those challenges, I think, is an important question.
Thank you, Daniel.
Really
maybe we have a last question.
Bunch of black boxes out there.
Okay. You guys should at least turn your thingy on. So turn your webcam on so that we feel like there are people here.
Okay. If not, so thank you very much, Daniel, and we will see you for the final review.
Great. I look forward to it. Thank you very much for the invitation, and I'm happy to follow up with any questions if people want to email me or other things come up. Don't hold back. Happy to respond. Thanks again.
Bye-bye.
Okay, ciao.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.